Hey, welcome back. In this video, we're going to work more with our custom data type, AnimData, and we're going to learn different ways to initialize a struct. We're going to create an AnimData variable for our nebula hazards. Let's get started. So here we have our ScarfyData AnimData struct variable, and we've initialized all of its members with values. Now, if you'll recall, just above Scarfy variables, we have our nebula variables. We've created a texture2D called nebula, and then we created a rectangle called nebrec, a vector2 called nebpos, and also a rectangle in vector2 for our second nebula, and we called these neb2rec and neb2pos. We then created our variables used for updating the animation frames for both nebulas. Now, we can make this much more efficient by using our AnimData struct. Let's start out by making our AnimData for the first nebula. So let's create a comment and say AnimData for nebula. Now, I'm going to create an AnimData, and I'm going to call this one NebData. Now, I can initialize NebData with braced initialization on the same line that I declare it. Now, what goes in these braces is a comma-separated list of values that I'd like to give to NebData's member variables. Now, they have to be of the correct type and in the correct order. Now, the first member variable in AnimData is a rectangle called rec. So how do I pass in a rectangle value? Well, this is how you do it. You put a pair of braces, and inside the braces, you have an initializer list for the rectangle. Now, our initializer list for the rectangle must be in the correct order and have the correct type. Now, we can remind ourselves what that order is by right-clicking right here on the rectangle keyword and going to peak and peak definition. And we'll get this preview window popping up showing us the member variables inside of the rectangle struct. Now, they're all floats, and they're in the order x, y, width, and height. Okay, let's close that pop-up window, and let's initialize our NebData's rectangle with our x, y, width, and height. Well, it just so happens we want to use these values here, which are what we initialized the rectangle called nebrec to. So go ahead and copy those values and paste them in the braces here for the first item in our initializer list for NebData. Now that takes care of initializing NebData's first member variable, which is a rectangle. Now we can remind ourselves what NebData's second member variable is by scrolling up and looking at our definition for AnimData. Remember, the second member variable is a vector2 called pos. Now back down here to our line where we're initializing NebData, the second value that we pass into NebData's initializer list is going to also be inside its own pair of braces because it's going to be a vector2. Now, a vector2 has two members, x and y. Now, for the values here, let's take a look at what we initialized nebpos to. Nebpos was the vector2 we had already created earlier. For the x, we used window width, and for the height, we used window height minus nebrec.height. So here in our initializer list for the AnimData called NebData, we're going to pass in the x and y values for the vector2 in this pair of braces here. For the x, we're going to use window width. And for the height, we want to use the window height minus the height of a single nebula sprite, but we're not going to be using nebrec anymore. So what are we going to use to initialize the y in our vector2 for NebData? Now you may have guessed it. If you guessed window height minus nebula.height divided by 8, you were correct. So we're going to use window height minus nebula.height divided by 8. Okay, so our initializer list for NebData now has the rectangle initialized as well as the vector2. Next, we need to initialize the third member of the AnimData called NebData. Let's scroll up to AnimData and see what that third member is. It's an integer called frame. Okay, so here in our initializer list for neb data, the third value is going to be that integer called frame. We're going to start off at frame 0, so we're going to pass in 0. Let's scroll up and see the next variable. It's called update time and it's a float. Well, if we scroll back down, we'll see that we initialized neb update time to 1.0 divided by 12.0. Let's go ahead and copy that and use that as the value in our initializer list for update time. Now next, we need to initialize the very last member variable, and that's running time. And we're going to initialize that to a value of 0. So we're going to place a 0 here in the member initializer list. Now, this is a big long line, and because the compiler ignores white space, we can put each of these on its own line. So I'm going to click right here just before the first item in our initializer list and hit enter. And that will put it on its own line. And then I'm going to click just before the second item on our initializer list and hit enter and put that on its own line. Now I'll also go ahead and put the remaining 3 items on their own lines, and now we can more clearly see each item in the initializer list. I'm going to put the closing brace along with its semicolon on its own line here. And then I'm going to add a short little comment after each item in this initializer list so we know which one is which. For the first one, I'm going to say rectangle rec. For the second one, I'm going to say vector2 pause. For the third, I'm going to say int frame. For the fourth, I'm going to say float update time. And for the fifth, I'm going to say float running time. These comments will just remind us which value is which in this member initializer list. So this is another way that we can use to initialize a struct. So here's your challenge. Create an anim data variable for the second nebula. Go ahead and call it neb2 data, and refer to the old variables for the second nebula so you'll know how to initialize the member variables of our new anim data variable. Pause the video and do this now. Okay, so just like we did for neb data, we're going to create a new anim data. So let's say anim data, and we're going to call this second one neb2 data. Now let's go ahead and initialize this one just like we did with neb data. Now we need an initializer list. Now the first item in this list is going to be a rectangle which will require its own pair of braces, and this will have 4 values. Let's take a look at neb2rec, the rectangle we created for the second nebula. For this, we had a value of 0 for the x, 0 for the y, and nebula.width divided by 8 for the width, and nebula.height divided by 8 for the height. So we can go ahead and copy these values and paste them here in the braces of the first element for our initializer list. Now we need a comma, and now we can work on the second value, which is going to be a vector2 value. Now we also need a pair of braces for this value, and for this we need 2 values, an x and a y. Now let's take a look at the vector2 we created called neb2 pause. For this, we had window width plus 300 for the x. Let's go ahead and copy that and paste it in for the x here in our initializer list. And for the y, we used window height minus nebrec.height. But again, we're not using nebrec anymore, so we need to know how we can get the height of a single nebula sprite. Well, we know from nebrec that the height of a single nebula sprite is nebula.height divided by 8. So here in our initializer list, the y for our pause vector2 is going to be window height minus nebula.height divided by 8. So that will be the value for the vector2. Next is our integer called frame. We're going to initialize this to 0. Now, the next variable is a float called update time. And if we scroll down a little bit, we'll see that we initialized the neb2 update time to 1/16th of a second. Let's go ahead and copy that and use that here in our initializer list. And finally, we have one last variable to initialize, and that is running time. We can give that a value of 0.0. And that is going to initialize our neb2 data. Great job. So in summary, we created some new anim data variables for the nebula hazards. We learned different ways to initialize a struct. We now know that we can assign values to member variables by accessing them via the dot operator, and we can also initialize a struct on the same line that we declare it using a braced initializer list. So now that we have anim data variables for SCARFy and the nebula hazards, we're ready to start using these variables to make our code a bit more efficient. I'll see you in the next video.